Hello. In this extra session, I want to follow up what I've been saying about reading the Old Testament and to focus a little more on Old Testament narrative. This is a big topic, and even with this extra session, I can only cover a small part of it, but I hope this will be helpful. Now, we've already looked at the key features of narrative or storytelling. Let me begin by saying a little more about the narrator, the one who tells the story. The narrator is generally viewed as all-knowing and all-seeing. Sometimes stories are told in the first person by one of the characters. We see that, for example, in parts of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, in that case, the narrator is limited in his movements and knowledge to what that character can do and know. But usually, the narrator knows everything and can be anywhere. He knows characters' thoughts and feelings. He hears intimate conversations. He's even aware of what God is thinking, as for example in Genesis 6:6 and 8:21. Now, this privileged knowledge is explained by inspiration. The narrator is also able to move from place to place. So, for example, 1 Samuel 4:1-7 describes a battle between Israel and the Philistines, which results in the Ark of the Covenant, this symbol of God's presence that was kept at that time at Shiloh, being captured. Now, the narrator begins by describing the two respective camps and of the battlefield, giving an overview of the scene. He then describes what's happening in the Israelite camp following their defeat. And that results in men being sent to Shiloh to bring back the ark. And the narrator here stays in the Israelite camp, describing the men going and then describing them coming back. Now, when the ark comes into the camp, the Israelites cheer, and the narrator is there to describe that. But then in verses 6-9, he's in the Philistine camp, describing their reaction to the noise that they hear. In verses 10 and 11, he is again on the battlefield, describing the Philistine victory. And in verse 12, he watches as a messenger leaves the battle line and goes towards Shiloh. Then the narrator is at Shiloh with Eli, watching the messenger arrive and going on into the city. And the narrator is there too, as the messenger comes from the city and speaks to Eli. Now, in this way, the narrator is a bit like the camera in a film or TV drama, showing different scenes, sometimes giving a wide view, sometimes a more intimate close-up, sometimes showing things from the point of view of the different characters. Now, let me just give you a quick example of how things within a narrative may be viewed from different perspectives. In 1 Samuel 31-3, David and his men returned to Ziklag, where they were based. It has just been attacked by the Amalekites, and the Amalekites have taken captives, referred to in verse 2 as the women and everyone else in the city, both young and old. Now, that's how these captives appear from the point of view of the Amalekites. They are hostages, and they refer to them in this impersonal way. But from the point of view of David and his men, in verse 3, they are their wives and sons and daughters. Different points of view, different ways of looking at what is happening. And one of the things to look for in a story is whose point of view is it being told from. Now, another key feature that we've mentioned is wordplay. As we look at Old Testament narrative, it's important to remember that the writers were teachers and instructors who wanted to get their message across as effectively as possible. And to do that, they used their skills in storytelling and use of language. In my view, the writers of the biblical text, as well as being inspired by the Spirit, also worked with reliable historical traditions. Though I would also want to allow that they had some freedom in the way they used those traditions and in the way they told the story. Now, we've seen something of that already when we looked at the reporting of history. Now, this flexibility includes the way they repeat words or leave some words out, the particular words they use, how the story is put together, which things are emphasized at which points in the story, and so on. Let's look at a few more Old Testament texts to show how this might work. Let's start with Genesis 4:2b-5. This describes Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, bringing sacrifices. Abel's sacrifice was accepted. Cain's sacrifice was rejected. And the key question here is why? Now, there have been several suggestions. One is that Abel's sacrifice was more acceptable because it involved the shedding of blood. That, though, is unlikely. At this point in the biblical story, no rules about sacrifice have yet been given. And the word for sacrifice could be applied both to animal and grain offerings. And even when the sacrificial system was up and running, grain offerings could still be acceptable. Now, given his occupation, Cain's sacrifice of crops from the field seems quite appropriate. So what other reason might there be? There seems to be a clue in the text. In the description of Abel's sacrifice, the narrator tells us that he brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. Now we can compare that with the description of what Cain brought, some of the fruits of the soil. Now this draws attention to a clear distinction between the two. Abel brought the very best that he had. Now fat may not strike us as the best, but in those days it was. And the firstborn of the flock also points to the best and the most valuable. You might say Abel brought the best of the best. Cain, on the other hand, brought some of the fruits of the soil. He doesn't seem to have taken particular care with what he brought. He had to bring a sacrifice, but it appears from the way it's described that anything would do. And by his careful use of language, the narrator emphasizes that the difference here is not the sacrifices themselves, but the attitude with which they were offered and their value to the one who was offering them. And that has something to say to us and to our attitude to what we bring to God. Now, second, I want to look at Genesis 39, the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Now here we see several accounts of the same incident, which are told differently to achieve different effects. Now, I'm sure we're familiar with the story. Joseph, we're told, was well built and handsome, and Potiphar's wife tried to persuade him on several occasions to sleep with her, but he was having none of it. Until one day she thought there was an opportunity. And in verses 11 and 12, we have the narrator's account. One day he, Joseph, went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She, Potiphar's wife, caught him by the cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Now, we take this version to be the correct one. The general rule in Old Testament narrative is that the narrator is reliable. The words of other characters may be less so, but in general, the narrator's version of events is correct. Now here, as well as the narrator's account, we have two further versions given by Potiphar's wife. First to the servants in verses 14 and 15, and then to her husband Potiphar in verses 17 and 18. Now what we see in these respective accounts is repetition, but with some key changes. Now, given what has happened, Potiphar's wife has to offer some explanation. She can't rule out the possibility that Joseph was seen entering the house and then leaving it in a state of undress. And she can't risk that being reported to Potiphar. Having Joseph's cloak in her hand is also incriminating evidence. So she needs a convincing story. Now, first, she speaks to the servants, because if she doesn't, they may give their own version of events to Potiphar, and she needs to take some kind of control over what they will say. Now, as part of her story, she decides to incriminate Joseph. Now, that may be partly because she was angry at being rejected, though it may be that this was just the best way of explaining what the servants may have seen. Now, in her report to the servants, she emphasizes that Joseph is a Hebrew, a foreigner. She also uses the word us several times. In that way, she identifies herself with the rest of the household, and she presents Joseph as an outsider. She allies herself with the other servants. She and they are in this together. And by doing that, she creates distance between them and Joseph. Now, when she talks to Potiphar, she describes Joseph as a slave. She very carefully doesn't say that to the servants, because that would give Joseph something in common with them. And that is what she wants to avoid. She wants them on her side in a common cause against this interloper. Now, this Hebrew, she says, has been brought to us to make sport of us. That's the NIV translation. Now, this expression, to make sport of, here means something like to laugh at or to insult. It may also suggest sexual intimacy, and here it is paralleled with to sleep with. Though Potiphar's wife specifically says, make sport of us. This is not just about her. And again, by her careful use of language, Potiphar's wife implies that this attempted rape by Joseph is only the most serious of a series of insults that not only she, but all members of the household have been forced to endure since Joseph arrived. And to further that aim, she blames Potiphar, and she suggests that Potiphar deliberately brought Joseph into the house to insult us, her and the servants. And by placing herself alongside the rest of the household against Potiphar, and suggesting that Potiphar maybe has a vested interest in this, favoring Joseph above the other servants, she may hope that the servants won't report the event because of possible repercussions against them. Or if they do, any report will be sympathetic to her. Now, to support her lie, Potiphar's wife makes two changes to what is narrated. First, she changes the order of events. In the narrator's account, Joseph fled, and then Potiphar's wife called for the servants. In her accounts, the call becomes a scream for help, and it was because she screamed that Joseph ran. Now, if the servants had seen Joseph leave the house, it's likely to have been after they heard the shout, so they wouldn't be sure what the order of events had been, and they couldn't question Potiphar's wife's version. And then second, instead of reporting that the cloak was left in her hand, she tells the servants and Potiphar that Joseph left it beside her. Now, when she comes to give her report to Potiphar, it can't be very different from the one to the servants, because they may speak to him and compare notes. However, it contains further subtle changes. Joseph is now, as I've said, this Hebrew slave. He is still a foreigner, but he is now also a servant. Now, this identifies Potiphar's wife with her husband and creates distance between them and Joseph. Joseph is a servant who has abused the trust that was placed in him. And now she is more specific. He came to make sport of me, indicating that this now does refer specifically to sexual intimacy and emphasizes Joseph's crime is attempted rape. Now, both expressions, this Hebrew slave and make sport of me, are designed to maximize Potiphar's anger. And as a further attempt to manipulate her husband, she also tries to make him feel guilty by implying that it is his fault that Joseph was there. He is the Hebrew slave that you brought us. Now, this gives an idea of the different ways of looking at the story and the way language can be used to tell the story differently and also to manipulate the hearers or the readers. Let's take another example, the story of Samson and Delilah in Judges 16. Now, this is set during the Philistine oppression of Israel and against the background of the threat that Samson poses to the Philistines. The beginning of this story, Delilah is approached by the Philistine leaders to discover the secret of Samson's strength. Now, this builds on something that is clear from earlier narratives, Samson's weakness for women. And in these verses, Delilah asks Samson 4 times to confide in her. Her motives are clear. She is to be well paid. What is going on in Samson's mind, though, is less clear, though the text may give us some insights. Now, these 4 sections of the narrative, 6 to 9, 10 to 12, 13 and 14, 15 to 20, though they do overlap and flow into each other, are further demonstrations of repetition. There are several similarities between them, but also some significant differences. The first 2 follow pretty much the same pattern. Let me read just the first of those. Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man." Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. With men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. And then Delilah said to Samson, "You have made a fool of me, you lied to me," and so on. Now, here are the key elements that we find there. First, Delilah presses Samson to know the secret of his strength and how he can be bound. Second, Samson lies, and he points to things that are wholly unrelated to his hair. In the first passage, he can be tied with bowstrings. In the second, it is with new ropes. After that, Delilah follows Samson's instructions in detail. We're also told that there are men hidden in the room waiting to capture Samson once he has become weak. Next, Delilah calls out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And this is followed by Samson easily snapping off his bonds. Delilah then complains that she has been made a fool of, and this leads to the next section. Now, in these cases, we make the reasonable assumption that Samson is asleep when he is tied, though the text does not say so explicitly. It seems fairly certain, too, that the men hidden in the room do not reveal themselves. There is no mention of the mayhem that usually results from an encounter between Samson and the Philistines. And given the threat, it seems likely that they would certainly wait to see whether or not Samson really had been subdued before showing themselves. And when we come to the third occasion, the pattern is slightly different. The first element is the same. Delilah asks him about his strength. The second is similar, though here we see the first mention of Samson's hair. He still doesn't tell the truth, but the change seems significant. Is this a sign that Samson is weakening? Or is it a sign of overconfidence? Is Samson pushing the boundaries of what is wise because he feels that he has nothing to fear? Now, again, Delilah follows Samson's instructions, though for the first time there is a reference to Samson sleeping and later waking up. Now, this has been assumed, as I've said, but on this occasion, the narrator chooses to mention it explicitly. And this highlights a key aspect of narrative, what the narrator draws attention to at any particular point in the story. And the specific reference to Samson sleeping here seems significant. Is the narrator telling us, for example, that Samson is lowering his guard? And that is something that would also fit with Samson's careless reference to his hair. The fourth element from the previous accounts is missing altogether. There is no mention of men hidden in the room. Now, this may suggest that the Philistines were losing interest and that Delilah is now in danger of losing the money she was promised. And that may be what spurred her on to the greater efforts that we see in verses 15 and 16. Now, as in each of the other cases, Delilah calls out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And then we see another difference. In the first 2 passages, the emphasis is on breaking free completely. His bonds are snapped off easily. In this third passage, while Samson does break free, the pin and fabric remain attached. Is the narrator suggesting that he is not completely free? And Delilah's response is also different. She plays her trump card, emotional blackmail. How can you say, I love you, when you won't confide in me? And this is followed by prolonged nagging that finally wore him down in verse 16. And in this final section, we see a similar structure, but with a different outcome. As we have seen, Delilah's asking about his strength is replaced now by continual nagging until Samson is sick to death. Now, given his past history, you might ask, why doesn't Samson just leave? And the answer is because with Delilah, things are different. He is in love with her. We've been told that in verse 4. And now, if he wants to continue the relationship, Samson must tell her the truth. And so, because of his unique feelings for Delilah, he tells the whole story. She then goes back to the rulers of the Philistines, and they again take a personal interest. Delilah again follows Samson's instructions. There is also a reference here to Samson sleeping, though putting him to sleep seems a little more sinister. She then calls for a man to shave his hair. Now this, as well as having him sleep on her lap, suggests an element of care. Could it be that there is some regret here? Delilah perhaps does have some affection for Samson, but her affection for money seems much greater. Now, on this occasion, there is no specific mention of men hidden in the room, but we don't need that because it's already been made clear that the Philistines have returned. Again, Delilah calls out, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And again, Samson wakes up, but on this occasion, his strength has gone and he is subdued. We're also given a surprise insight into what Samson is thinking, something that we don't see on any of the other occasions. He says to himself, which is another way of saying he thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. Now, on the assumption that all of the information in the narrative is relevant to the plot, we may wonder how that is significant. Now, the repetition with variation here suggests a progression in the story. And in my view, one of the factors in that progression is Samson's overconfidence. After the first two unsuccessful attempts to subdue him, he seems to have become more blasé and more willing to expose himself to being discovered. The first reference to his hair is certainly a lie, but it points in the right direction. And that overconfidence seems to be seen further in what Samson was thinking when he awoke. On each of the first three occasions, Delilah had followed Samson's instructions exactly, and that meticulous obedience is highlighted in the repetition in the story. He said 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she used 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried. In the second, she used new ropes, just as he instructed. On the third occasion, he told her to weave the 7 braids of his head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with the pin. And what did Delilah do? She took the 7 braids of his hair, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with the pin. Now, by using repetition like this, the narrator seems to say more than he needs to, but that's part of the wordplay. Where actions follow exactly the instructions given, it points to meticulous obedience. We see the same thing when God gives Noah instructions to build the ark. What God says, Noah does exactly, and that emphasizes his obedience. So to come back to Delilah, she followed his instructions to the letter. So on this final occasion, Samson must have expected Delilah to follow his instructions again. He must have known that while he was sleeping, his hair would be cut. Even so, when he woke up, he thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. In other words, though he must have known he would lose his hair, he does not seem to think that he would lose his strength. And this is further emphasized in the next expression, he did not know that the Lord had left him. Samson was supremely overconfident, and this, combined with his weakness for women, led to his downfall. The problem is he had been successful and he had performed great feats of strength for so long that he had forgotten the true source of his ability. Now, Samson was called to be a Nazirite, though there are indications that he perhaps paid lip service to that calling. As a Nazirite, he was consecrated to God, and not cutting his hair was a sign of that calling. The vow also involved not taking wine or strong drink and not going near a corpse. We're not sure about the drinking, but Samson was frequently around dead bodies and even stripped the clothes from 30 Philistines that he had killed. Being consecrated to God would probably also include not marrying someone outside Israel, though that is not explicitly forbidden. And Samson's general demeanor, apart from his hair, does not point to one who takes his consecration very seriously. That being so, it seems only a question of time before he began to view not cutting his hair less seriously too. And in the end, it appears that he viewed his strength as something he possessed rather than something that he needed to rely on God for. Now, this is in stark contrast to the emphasis of the narrator, who attributes Samson's strength and his achievements to the Spirit of God. Interestingly, in this story and the one immediately before it, there is no reference to the Spirit as the source of Samson's strength, and that may point to Samson's reduced reliance on God. But God does not give up on him. And in verse 22, there is a clear sign of hope. The hair on his head began to grow again. And significantly, in the final act of his life, Samson does again recognize his dependence on God. Now, following the analysis of this narrative, this suggests that the key theological emphasis here is that the leaders of God's people must depend on God for their power. Now, the last thing that I want to mention here is what is called dramatic irony. This is when a character sees things from one point of view, while the reader, through the narrator, knows that he or she has got it completely wrong. And the actions of characters results in the opposite of what they expect or intend. The book of Esther contains a great deal of this, mostly at the expense of one of the key characters, Haman. The setting of Esther is Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, in the 5th century BC. It's during the reign of Ahasuerus, who is usually identified with Xerxes I, Xerxes the Great. Now, following the Babylonian invasion, the people of Judah were taken into exile. The Babylonian Empire eventually gave way to the Persian Empire, and though some Jews returned to Judah, many more stayed. And that meant that there were significant Jewish communities scattered throughout the empire. Now, as the book's name indicates, an important figure in the narrative is Esther, a young Jewish girl who becomes queen. Important too is the conflict between Mordecai, a Jew and Esther's guardian, and Haman, the Persian king's most senior official. Haman hates Mordecai because he refuses to bow to him, and Haman plots to kill not only Mordecai, but also to wipe out his people, the Jews. One clear example of dramatic irony is in chapter 6, verse 6, where the king asks Haman what should be done for the man the king delights to honor. Now, as readers, we have been told that the king is speaking here about rewarding Mordecai, but we also see how Haman misunderstands the situation. Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? He then outlines the honor that he would like to receive, only to see it bestowed on Mordecai, his enemy. Ouch. There is also irony in the fact that Esther, the queen, is a Jew, and so is subject to the same sentence of death as other Jews, but Haman doesn't know it. Now, this comes to a height when Haman is invited to a banquet prepared by Esther, and he boasts about his invitation. He sees this as a sign of favor. But we know that Esther intends to use it to expose his plot against her and her people to the king, an attempt on her life that will result in Haman's execution. In the meantime, as part of his plot, Haman builds gallows on which to hang Mordecai. And there is a supreme irony when he ends up being hanged on his own gallows. Now, the significance of this emphasis on irony may be to reassure the Jews and to give a warning to their enemies that plans against them will rebound on those who make them. They may expect one outcome, but the outcome will be very different from the one that they expect. Now, there may be a further subtle irony in the structure of the book as a whole. As is well known, God is never mentioned by name in the book. This appears to be deliberate. And even where there is a clear opportunity to refer to God's providence, as in 4:14, for example, the reference is only to help coming from another quarter. It could easily talk about help coming from God, which suggests that the not mentioning the name of God is deliberate. Now, one reason for that may be that the book is intended to tell the story, ironically, from Haman's understanding of the world. Haman, alongside many others in Persia, put his confidence in fate, but he and they will be confounded. The story is full of what appears to be coincidences, but these things work against Haman and for the Jews, where they rely on fate and they cast lots for when the destruction of the Jews will take place. Again, that works against Haman and the other Persians, indicating that there is a higher providence at work here that the Jews are aware of, but that their enemies know nothing about. Now, as I've said, there is much more about Old Testament narrative that we could look at. I hope, though, that this gives an idea of the usefulness of this approach. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be back later.